Hello everyone and welcome back to Muddy Mint. Today we're going to be doing part 2 of our SoapCalc video. We're going to be focusing on recipe formulation today. And basically I'm just going to talk a little bit about how I personally formulate recipes. So everybody has their own way of doing things and this may not be exactly how you would do it, but hopefully it'll give you some insight into basically how my brain works when I'm doing recipe formulation for palm-free soaps. So we make specifically all natural and palm-free recipes. And so this video will definitely be focused more on those types of formulations. So if you missed our first video, I highly recommend that you watch that first because it will give you quite a bit of information on how to use SoapCalc. In that video, we entered a recipe into SoapCalc from the Brambleberry website, which I will be looking at again today. And then we also resized that recipe. We changed some of the oils in that recipe, and I showed you how to use a 50-50 lye water solution for that recipe. So we did quite a lot in that video and it ended up being quite long, but I also wanted to talk more specifically about recipe formulation, particularly the soap qualities that you see in SoapCalc and what they mean and what to look for when you're formulating your own soap recipes, which is one of the super fun things to do when you're a soap maker. Rather than following a recipe, it's nice to come up with your own formula that you absolutely love. So hopefully this video will give you some tips and tricks on how to do that. So I'm going to share my screen with you, and so we'll get started over here. All right, so over here I have the exact same recipe that we entered in our previous SoapCalc video. And I decided to start here just so it feels more like a continuation of what we were doing before. And this particular recipe, if you missed that video, is from Brambleberry. And I found the recipe here on their website. This is the Golden Pumpkin Soap recipe, Golden Pumpkin Soap Project. And so I entered all this information for the recipe in there. And then this recipe did not have any information for superfat or water to lye ratio. So we calculated that as well in the previous recipe. So if you don't know how to do that, definitely, not the previous recipe, the previous video. So if you don't know how to do that, definitely go and check that video out. All right, so now we have this recipe and it's in SoapCalc. And I can click Calculate Recipe, View or Print. And here is the full recipe laid out so you can easily make it yourself. Now we talked about how to resize this batch in the previous video, so I'm not going to do that this time around. But if you do want to resize for your own batch first and you want to follow along, then definitely do that first. Okay, so this recipe is 54 ounces of oils, and I talked about the importance of looking at the oil total rather than the soap total. They are two different things, and it's important to know what your oil amount is when you're creating your own soap recipes. And over here, you'll see that there's some properties. They call them soap bar qualities. And they give you a range here. This is SoapCalc is coming up with this particular range for soap where it should fall into for each of these properties. And this is just a guide. So keep that in mind when you're looking at this because a lot of really amazing soap recipes do not fall exactly into these guidelines. But this recipe shows that it has a hardness of 35 right here, and cleansing of 14, conditioning of 61, bubbly of 16, and 23 creamy. So these are the properties that your bar of soap will have if you make this exact recipe. And this is calculated based on the fatty acid profile of this particular soap. And those numbers are right here over on the right-hand side. So I'm not going to get into super detailed information about fatty acid profiles. You could definitely do a deep dive into that topic, and a lot of soap makers know far more than I do about that particular topic. Some soap makers actually formulate their recipes based on these fatty acid profiles specifically. And What I will say is that SoapCalc is lacking a little bit in this. They do a great job of coming up with this range and giving you a number, which gives you a pretty good idea of what your soap is going to end up like, but it's not perfect because what they're really doing here, for example, this hardness number of 35, is they're adding up these first 4 fatty acids. If you add all these numbers up, that's going to give you 35. And so what they're doing is they're taking all the saturated oils in the recipe, which tend to be those harder oils like butters, palm oil, coconut oil, those types of oils and butters. And they are grouping them together to come up with a hardness number. And so that is a great way to visually see what the properties of your soap are going to be, but it's not perfect because these different fatty acids contribute to your soap differently. So SoapCalc is treating them kind of the same and putting them all in one bulk number, if you will, but it's not the whole story. And if you dive into fatty acid profiles and what each of them means and how they contribute to soap, you'll get a much better picture of what is actually happening here. But again, I'm not going to talk about that in this video. We are going to stick to the basics. And honestly, the basics is all you need for a recipe formulation. So if you're so inclined, definitely look into those fatty acid profiles and get more information. But I'm going to touch on it a little bit, but not too much in this video. So as you can see, all of these numbers fall into the range. So the hardness is in the range that they expect here. And this range is just something to look for when you're formulating your recipe, but it's not necessarily, if you have a soap that doesn't fall into these ranges, and I'll show you a soap that doesn't fall into this at all, that's a great soap, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be a bad soap. And similarly, if it does fall into these ranges, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be a good soap either. So just keep that in mind. Take this information with a grain of salt. It's not the end all and be all of soap formulation. It's just a really great place to start. It's a good place to begin and then let that guide you on your journey. And the only way to really know how a soap's going to turn out is to actually make it. So, but this will save you a lot of time in making a bunch of recipes that potentially wouldn't work. All right, so the qualities that we have, I already outlined what they are. And then at the bottom here, we have iodine and INS. And I completely ignore those numbers, and that's what we're going to do today. If you want to look into what iodine and INS means, you certainly can. And I do know that some soap makers particularly look at the INS number. Some soap makers like to have an INS of about 160. And that is one way of checking your recipe. But I actually don't look at these numbers at all. And I feel like it's sort of an older way of recipe formulation. And I think it was originally meant for, mass manufactured soaps. And so keep that in mind that these numbers aren't necessarily going to give you too much information unless you know exactly what those numbers mean. All right. So the hardness of this particular bar is 35. So it's in the middle range here. And like I said, this is because of the coconut oil and the palm oil and the cocoa butter in this recipe. So those are the hard oils in our recipe, and they are contributing to the hardness of your bar. The next number is cleansing. And this is one that is really confusing for a lot of people because most people think that if this number is not in the range, then your soap isn't actually going to clean. But just remember that all soap cleans. For example, an olive oil soap, and I'll show you an example of this in a minute, has a cleansing number of 0. Yet olive oil soap still cleans. It's still going to pick up dirt and oil from your skin and wipe it away. So what this number really means in my mind, or this is how I think about it, I think about it as like an oil stripping number. So when something is really cleansing, it's going to strip the oils off your skin. You're going to get that squeaky clean feeling, but it's going to be probably over the top if that number is really high. So that's going to contribute to your soap feeling drying. And coconut oil is the one that's notorious for causing high cleansing. So coconut oil is a very cleansing oil when it is saponified. That's also another thing to remember, is that all these numbers refer to that oil when it's saponified. It doesn't have anything to do with, just putting straight coconut oil directly on your skin is just fine. But when it's in soap and it's saponified using lye, it is quite a cleansing oil. And when this cleansing number is really high, what it ends up feeling like in your soap is a soap that feels super duper drying. And you hear a lot about people who have, tried using handmade soap and found it far too drying and then basically given up on it. It's highly likely that those people have used a soap that is high in coconut oil. Now, coconut oil adds a lot of hardness to a bar, so a lot of people like to use it in high amounts. But when this cleansing number is really high, it's going to end up feeling drying. So I like to think of this as a balance. You want your hardness to be, as high as possible, and then the cleansing to be as low as possible. That's kind of how I think about it. Not everybody is going to think that way. Remember that some bars that are supposedly not hard, like the olive oil soap that I was talking about, they actually are hard. And that's because SoapCalc doesn't take into account cure time, and it doesn't take into account your water discount. So SoapCalc is literally just looking at the fatty acid profile for these oils. It's not looking at if you have a superfat in your soap. It's not looking at the water amount. Anyway, the point is that it's not going to look at other ingredients in your soap like goat milk or, any other kind of additional liquid if you're adding colloidal oatmeal. All of these things are going to contribute a ton to how your bar feels. And you can counteract some of those drying effects by increasing superfat. You can counteract it by, creating a goat milk soap or using a lot of soft, nourishing oils in your soap. So these are all things that you pick up over time when you've made soap for a long time. But I will just say that the hardness, while it is indicative of how many hard oils you have in your recipe, it doesn't mean that your bar isn't going to be hard. If your bar is too soft, you can use less water next time you make it, and then it'll end up being harder and it'll also cure a little bit faster. Or you can cure your bar for longer. For instance, for olive oil bars, you can cure them for several months and then they end up really, really rock hard and really beautiful. So hardness is maybe more of a quality that allows you to have your bar ready to use quicker, perhaps. It's going to indicate how long your bar is going to last in the shower under, good conditions. So those bars may last a little bit longer. For example, a coconut oil bar will probably last longer than an olive oil bar, even if the olive oil bar has been cured for longer. So that's just something to take into account. Hardness is not as important of a number as a lot of people want it to be. I look for hardness at about 40, for instance, in our recipes. And when you don't use palm oil in your soap, you do want to make up for some of that hardness, and we'll talk about how to do that in a minute. All right, so that's hardness and cleansing. Conditioning and bubbly, or let's just do conditioning by itself. Conditioning means that you have these nice, nourishing oils in your soap, and I look for really high conditioning. So this soap is actually great. It's got good hardness, could be a little harder, but it's not bad. Then it's got 14 cleansing, which is on the lower side, and that's because our coconut oil is at 20%. I always look for coconut oil at 25% or less personally. Then it's got conditioning of 61, which is on the higher end of the range. And that means that you're going to be using oils like olive oil, sweet almond oil, some of those soft oils that really feel nice and soft on your skin, and they're not cleansing at all. And so they help bring back some of that moisture that you lose from some of the coconut oil, the cleansing from the coconut oil. And then bubbly and creamy. This is another one where bubbly, people want this to be off the charts high. And this one is actually quite low. And I actually look for a low number when I'm formulating. And the reason is that I prefer small, creamy bubbles in my soap. So I look for a low bubbly number and a higher creamy number. And you'll see, once you do this for a while, you'll start to see which oils are imparting those properties to your soap and which ones aren't. So bubbliness, if you have a high coconut oil soap, you're going to tend to have big, fluffy lather. And if you have a low coconut oil soap, then you will probably have less lather. But if you add a lot of butters in there, you can actually make your lather more creamy. So it's kind of give and take there, but I feel like if you have a low bubbly but a high creamy, that's honestly one of the best lathers in my opinion. So all the soap will lather, all the soap will have bubbles. Even the olive oil soap, which is notorious for having low bubbles, still has great bubbles, especially when it's hard and it's been cured for a while. I find that it actually has a really great lather. Just remember that soap is soap. It's going to clean, it's going to be bubbly, it's going to have a lather, and it's going to do its job. So this list of bar qualities is just a little bit of extra information in case you want to change your properties slightly in the soap and make it feel a little bit more the way that you want. Okay, so now that we've talked about this particular recipe and its qualities, let's go see how we might be able to change this recipe into a palm-free formulation so that you can get very similar properties in your soap, but with a palm-free recipe. Now, for those of you who might be wondering, we don't use palm oil for environmental reasons because of the deforestation that happens with palm oil production. But this is a decision that we made a long time ago, and nowadays you can get sustainable palm oil. And so if you want to formulate with palm oil, just make sure that you're getting sustainable palm. But you can actually make really excellent soap without having to use palm oil. It is going to be a little bit more expensive because you tend to use butters instead of the palm oil, but you'll see in a minute exactly how we do it. So before we get into that, I do want to talk about this area over here. We talked about this a little bit in our last video, but I want to point out again that there are two columns here. The first one is called 1, and this is where if you've clicked a particular oil, you can see its properties. And these are the exact same properties that are in the soap. Or let me rephrase that. They're not the same properties that are in the soap. They're the properties that are in the oil, but then that's going to be added, obviously, to the soap when you add all your oils together. So this all number here, this is the exact same numbers that we had over here. These are the numbers for your actual recipe. So you can see the recipe numbers right here, as well as the fatty acid profile for the entire recipe. And then here you can see for the actual oil that we have clicked in our list. And we have castor oil chosen here. So you can see that castor oil actually adds no hardness or cleansing at all, but it adds a huge amount of conditioning, bubbly, and creamy. And that's because of its high amount of ricinoleic acid. So this particular fat, obviously, I probably didn't say that right, but anyway, castor oil is one of the very few that's high in this particular fatty acid. And that's why it's such a great oil to add to soap, because it really gives you something that none of the other oils can give you. And that's basically stability of lather. That's one of its main characteristics. So it adds, bubbly and creamy, but really what it's doing is it's helping maintain that lather for a longer period of time, keeping it stable, keeping the bubbles going. So it's all good stuff. So I love to use castor oil in my soaps. I typically use castor oil between 5 and 10%. So when I reformulate this recipe, I am going to bump this up to make this feel a little bit more like a soap that I would enjoy. If we look at olive oil, for instance, down here, you can see that has a tiny bit of hardness, but most of what it's giving you is conditioning properties in the bar. So when you're trying to replace a particular oil, like let's say palm oil, it helps to look at the fatty acid profile down here and then the resulting soap qualities to figure out which oil you want to replace this with. So if we're replacing palm oil, it mainly adds hardness, conditioning, and creaminess to your soap. So it's important to look for a replacement oil that is similar to palm oil or provides similar properties. In particular, the hardness is what I am interested in, because if I take out palm oil, I'm going to lose quite a bit of hardness. So when I was filming the previous video, the SoapCalc video, I put a lot of emphasis on using ounces when you're entering your recipe into SoapCalc and not relying on percentages. But when you're formulating recipes or adjusting recipes, it is a lot easier to do in percentages. So I'm going to switch this radio button over here to percentages. And we're going to take the palm oil out completely. And let's take a look at some of our butters. Let's look at shea butter. If I click on that, you'll see that it has a hardness of 45 and palm had a hardness of 50, just so you remember. Conditioning and creamy are also around 50. So this is actually very similar to palm oil. It adds a little bit more conditioning, less hardness, and less creaminess. But shea butter is a great substitute for palm oil. Now, if I look at cocoa butter, you'll see that cocoa butter actually adds more hardness, less conditioning, but more creaminess. And cocoa butter is actually one of my all-time favorite additions to soap, especially palm-free soap. And I use it all the time because I just love it so much. It really helps with that creamy lather and it provides quite a bit of hardness. Now, cocoa butter is quite expensive nowadays, and we did a whole video on this on rising oil prices if you're interested in that. But I still feel like it's worth using because it's such a good oil. So I'm going to put it in here, but I'm going to put it in at, oh yeah, it's telling me cocoa butter is already on the list. And it is, it's right down here. So I'm going to put the cocoa butter in at 10%. So we've replaced that 3 in here. I'm going to change this to 2 so it's a round number. And now we are going to add some shea butter. And I'm going to add that at 10% as well. And that doesn't quite make up the 20. If you click calculate recipe, it'll tell you that you actually are missing 3% in this recipe. And so I'm going to add it down here to the castor oil because castor oil, oops, not 3, 5. Castor oil is something that I really love including in recipes between 5 and 10%, usually closer to 5%. I usually go between 5 and 7, actually, to be more precise. So now this is starting to look like a pretty good recipe. So let's click calculate recipe. Now I'm going to click this multiple tabs button. And I didn't mention this in the last video, but if you want to have multiple tabs open up, you can click this, and then when I click view or print, you'll see that I have my old tab with the old recipe, and then I have the new tab over here. And this is handy if you're going back and forth between 2 to compare. It can get kind of crazy if you are doing a lot of formulations and then you've got tons of tabs open and it's hard to keep track, which is why I tend not to use it. But in this particular case, it's very useful. So if you'll remember, the original recipe had a hardness of 35 and a cleansing of 14. So let's take a look over here. With our new recipe that has shea and cocoa butter and a little bit more castor, our hardness went down by 1, so not very much. Cleansing is the same because our coconut oil amount stayed exactly the same. If I were to raise this coconut oil amount, you would see the cleansing go up. I like to keep my cleansing at 17 or less in soap formulations. I find that if it starts getting too close to this 22, then it's very drying. If I do go higher in coconut oil, then I will up the superfat, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So conditioning is actually slightly more in our new formula. And in the old one, we have 16 and 23. Remember, this is the palm oil version. So this is the one with palm oil. 16 and 23 for bubbly and creamy. And here we have 18 and 25. So this is actually going to be a more bubbly and creamy bar. So this is an easy way to replace palm oil in your formulations. You can also use kokum butter rather than cocoa butter. There are other butters that you could also use. And you don't have to use butters, by the way. You can have something that is a little bit less hard, and then you just use a little bit less water when you make that soap, or cure it for longer. So we'll talk about that a little bit later as well. But this is a great replacement for this recipe. Now, realistically, if I were to make this recipe, I would actually make a few other changes, and I will explain to you what's kind of going on in my head when I look at this recipe. And you may or may not agree with the changes I'm making, but I just wanted to go through how I would formulate this particular recipe. The first thing that comes out at me is that the sweet almond oil here at 20% is very high. And if we look at sweet almond oil, you'll see that it has a hardness of 7. And that's quite low. It is extremely conditioning, which is awesome. But I find that when I have made soaps with high amounts of sweet almond oil in the past, that they have been too soft for my liking. Now, again, this is a personal preference and you may feel completely differently, and that's fine. But for me, sweet almond oil is not something that I ever want to use more than 10%. And again, that's my own personal preference. I really love using avocado oil. And by the way, I talked about this in the last video, but one of the ways that I learned all this is just by formulating soaps. I did one with sweet almond oil. I did one with avocado oil. And it turns out I like the one with avocado oil more. And it didn't really occur to me that they had different hardnesses because I thought they were just both soft oils and about the same. But it turns out that it does make a difference because avocado oil has a hardness of 22. So even though it's less conditioning, I think it adds a little bit more hardness, and I prefer that in my soap formulas. So even so, I don't use avocado oil at 20% either because I find that a little bit too high. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to remove the sweet almond oil. And I'm going to add avocado oil. And we're going to do this at 10%. All right. So the other things I'm noticing in here is that there's no olive oil. Olive oil is one of my all-time favorite oils to use in soap. I really don't think that there's anything that is quite like it, in my opinion. I usually use olive oil at 40% or more in almost all my soap recipes. There's a few where I don't use olive oil at all, but that's kind of rare. So let's look up olive oil. And do you see how right now it shows some numbers here, but actually, even though olive oil is selected because I typed the name in, I actually need to click it and then it changes. So make sure you're looking at the right oil. You know, when you pick an oil, make sure you click on it. Double check that you're actually looking at the right thing. All right, so olive oil has a hardness of 17 and it is quite conditioning. So this makes up for some of the lack of conditioning of some of our other oils because we do want this to be a nice conditioning bar of soap. So I'm going to take out the canola because I'm not a huge fan of canola and I don't actually have any on hand. In the last video we did, I actually replaced all of this canola with olive oil and showed you how the lye amount changes. So we're going to do that again. Add in olive oil. And this was originally 15, but since I took away 10 from the sweet almond oil that was here before, I'm going to change this to 25. All right, so now we're starting to create a recipe that is more in line with the way that I formulate soaps. Now, that doesn't mean that your soap has to be exactly the same every single time. For instance, in this particular case, I could combine the olive oil and rice bran oil together and have that be 45%. I kind of like the idea of trying out rice bran in this recipe, so I'm going to leave it there. But let's see what it does to our soap formula. So again, I have multiple tabs selected. I'm going to click View or Print, and here's our result. Okay, so now we have 3 tabs open up here, and this is what I was talking about earlier about how it gets a little bit confusing. This is our formula where we replaced the palm oil with shea and cocoa butter. So I'm going to get rid of this because I want to be comparing the original recipe to my new recipe. All right, so the original recipe had a hardness of 35, a cleansing of 14, and a conditioning of 61. So now when I look at my recipe, you can see that the hardness has gone up. And that's because I took away the sweet almond oil and replaced it with avocado oil and olive oil. And so that helped with the hardness. And then the cleansing's the same, again, because the coconut oil is exactly the same. Our conditioning has gone down. So If this is an issue for you, you can definitely try to add more conditioning oils in here. But our bubbly and creamy, 18 and 29 now for creamy, is really, really good. And that's how, that's kind of what I like to see in my soaps. So for me, this is a really great recipe. If you wanted to make this a little bit harder, you could bump up the coconut oil. And maybe we'll do that real quick just so I can show you. Let's say you bump up the coconut oil to 25 and bring the rice bran down to 15. You'll see that our hardness has now gone up to 41, which is really great. It's a nice hard bar. I would never go above 25 with the coconut oil, 25% that is, because I don't want this cleansing number to be too high. However, if you do end up going higher with coconut oil, you can counteract that by increasing your superfat. So, this soap has a superfat of 6.2%. And superfat is something that is not included in the calculations of the soap bar quality. So you want to keep that in mind when you're formulating, because if you increase the superfat, it's not going to make any changes here. But if you've been making soap for any length of time, you know that superfat makes a huge difference in how the soap feels. And that's because superfat is free-floating oils that are left to just be on your skin. So this means there's 6.2% of the oils that are unsaponified. They have not reacted with the lye. In other words, there's less lye in the soap, which means that all those oils are going to saponify, and then there's going to be a little bit left that is left free floating in the bar. And those free floating oils end up on your skin. And so even though the coconut oil can be quite drying, that superfat is going to help bring some of that moisture back onto your skin, which feels super great. Now, there is a caution about superfat. You don't want to go too crazy with superfat because the oils that are free floating are more likely to get rancid. So you want to be sure that when you're formulating your soaps that you take that into account. All right, so we have basically recreated this soap in what I think is a great recipe. We started with this brambleberry recipe. We got rid of some of the oils that we don't have in stock, and we also made it palm oil free. And we added some great properties in here, particularly creamy and bubbliness, and a little bit of hardness as well. So I would then try and make the soap in a small batch and see what it ends up like. And it's not a soap I've ever made before. So if you're curious about what this feels like, you should definitely give it a try. I think it would be a great recipe, actually. All right, so now that you know how we would adjust this particular recipe, what if you were starting a recipe from scratch? Let's see what that would look like. Let me open this up in a new window. Recipe calculator, and now we have everything back at the beginning. I'm going to update these values. This is basically what I always do. We use a 2-to-1 water to lye ratio. I usually start at the superfat at about 5.5. And let's do one of the tried and true recipes out there. It's called the trifecta or the Holy Trinity, or it's got all kinds of names, I guess, but it's basically just 3 oils. And it's olive oil, palm oil, and coconut oil. This is a recipe that you see all over the place. A lot of people use this recipe, and it's basically 1/3 of each one of these oils. And there's a good chance that you've used a soap that has these 3 oils in it, because a lot of beginner soap makers will use this recipe and then go on to start a business, and then that's just the recipe that they always use. And palm oil and coconut oil are very inexpensive oils, so this is a very economical recipe. So if I calculate that and I look at the results, I'm going to close these other windows so I don't get confused. If I look at these results here, you'll see that this is a very hard bar of soap. It has a hardness of 49, but the cleansing is extremely high. It's actually off the recommended range at 23. So it's on the high side of the range, which means that this soap is really going to be stripping the oils off of your skin. So one way to counteract that is to increase the superfat in the soap. And I don't know if soap makers that are making this soap are doing that or not. And it's hard to tell from the ingredients what people are doing, especially when the order of ingredients, you know, if it says olive oil, palm oil, coconut oil, it kind of makes it look like there's less coconut oil in that soap, but it could be exactly the same amount like this recipe. So the cleansing number is far too high in my opinion. Now this depends on your skin type and what kind of soap you like. It's definitely going to contribute to a much harder bar. It's going to be a nice white bar of soap. And a lot of people might really enjoy this type of soap, especially if you have oilier skin. But for me, I would feel like this soap is far too drying. I'd be coming out of the shower trying to moisturize right away because it just feels like your skin has been stripped of moisture. And so one of the reasons that a lot of handmade soap feels drying is because of this high coconut oil amount. And this is something a lot of soap makers don't learn until a little bit later. So it's very common for people to use too much coconut oil. All right, the rest of it looks pretty good. It's not super conditioning. It's on the lower end of the conditioning. The bubbly looks good and the creamy looks good. So this is, you know, a decent recipe, a good place to start. But this is how I would change this recipe. So first of all, I would reduce the coconut oil to 25%. So let's just go through what I would do. I'd get rid of the palm oil entirely and probably replace it with a butter of some kind. Let's try kokum butter. Kokum butter is, oops, got the wrong butter here. Kokum butter is very hard and very creamy, and it has some conditioning properties. So that's a great choice for replacing palm oil. And let's say we do that at 10%. I definitely want to add castor oil to my soap because I absolutely love castor oil. So let's do maybe 7% in this one. And again, we're just playing around with recipes to see what we get. And then finally, I'm going to do the rest. Let's see. I'm going to put in 50 and click calculate because I'm kind of lazy sometimes with the math, but looks like I'm missing 8%. So this is going to be 58 up here. So there we go. We've got a pretty nice recipe here. It's got olive oil, kokum butter, coconut oil, and castor oil. And if you look over here on the side, these are the numbers for castor oil because that's what I have selected. And here is the entire recipe down here. And I didn't mention the saturated, unsaturated section over here. This refers to the soap, the entire soap. First of all, it's an all number rather than a one number. And it references the saturated fatty acids that are these first 4 numbers here. And then the unsaturated fatty acids, which are the last 4 numbers down here. I typically look for a 40-60 blend here, so this is pretty close. All right, I'm happy with this recipe. I've never made it before. I'd love to try it. Let's look at it in this format, which is a little bit easier to see where the numbers fall in the range. So the hardness is looking pretty good. This recipe, I may want to cure a little bit more or maybe use a little bit less water in. And the cleansing looks great. Again, 17 is my max, so I try to go 17 or less. Conditioning is really high, which is awesome. And the bubbly and creamy are both high as well. High for me, anyway, I should say. This isn't off the charts bubbly because it doesn't have a ton of coconut oil, but it's going to have a really nice, small, bubble, creamy lather, which is the kind that I prefer myself. So that's how I would formulate a recipe from scratch. Then you can basically play around and change things from here. You know, let's say you don't like 25% coconut oil and you only want to do 20. Then change that to 20 and add some other oil in here. Maybe sweet almond would actually be a good one. in a small amount because it is so conditioning. So let's say we add 5% of that sweet almond oil. And now when we look at the numbers, we've got a little bit less hardness, but our cleansing has gone down, our conditioning has been bumped way up. So these are all things that you can do in SoapCalc. Just play around and kind of decide what recipe that you want to make. And then you'll only know the final results when you actually make the soap. So definitely important to know that, because even though it might look good on paper, it might not be a great soap. For instance, if you make a 100% cocoa butter soap, let's see what that looks like. So it looks like it's crazy hard, which it would be, zero cleansing, which is okay. The conditioning doesn't look too bad. It doesn't look like it would be bubbly at all, but it'd be off the charts creamy. This looks like, maybe you could try it, and I've never tried it, but I know that Anne-Marie at Brambleberry has tried it, and she said it was a terrible bar of soap. However, if you do a 100% olive oil soap, which I will bring up here, calculate recipe, viewer print, you'll see that the numbers, none of these are actually in the range. 17 is very low, cleansing is 0, conditioning is actually on the super high side, bubbly is 0, and creamy is also quite low. And if we go back here, you'll notice that when I pick olive oil, the properties of the olive oil, since this is 100% olive oil soap, are also the properties for the soap, which makes sense, but I just wanted to point that out. The saturated unsaturated ratio is different than what I typically like, but I absolutely love an olive oil soap. And I think that I would probably do a little bit less water in here. Maybe I would have the super fat just at 5% and not worry about any extra super fat, because this is such a conditioning bar of soap. But this is a great soap, and it does not fit the mold at all of what the ranges are. So another example of this is a coconut oil soap. Coconut oil, as I said, is extremely drying, but you can make 100% coconut oil soap. That is great. And the trick is to use a higher super fat. So I'm going to change my super fat to 20%. And this is a bar of soap that a lot of people make. It's 100% coconut oil. By the way, if you make a 100% coconut oil soap that has 0% super fat or very low super fat, meaning it has no free-floating oils in the soap, it works great as laundry soap. Typically, laundry soap is 100% coconut oil. It also works great as dish soap because you don't have any of those extra oils sitting around, which you don't want on your clothes and on your dishes. But when you're using a coconut oil soap on your body, you do want those extra oils because the coconut oil will strip your skin of all of its moisture and oils, and then you want to add that back with the super fat. Now, if I take a look at this recipe in here, you'll see that it's extremely hard, which it is, and also extremely cleansing. It's going to be crazy bubbly according to this, not very creamy. So this will give you a big fluffy lather like coconut oil typically does. But because we've increased our super fat, this is actually a decent soap. Now, I find this soap to still be a little bit too drying for me, but it's actually not bad. And a lot of people absolutely love a pure coconut oil soap with 20% super fat. You could even do more super fat. And remember that those oils are free floating in the bar, so they could go rancid. Coconut oil doesn't go rancid as quickly as some other oils, so that's why it's a good one to do a high super fat with. But just keep all this stuff in mind, because a lot of times I'll get questions. I actually got a question recently from somebody asking about cleansing. They were looking at our face soap recipe, and they noticed that the coconut oil amount was really low and that the cleansing number was very low on SoapCalc. And so they were saying, how do I market this soap when it isn't cleansing at all, when it's supposed to be cleaning your face? Well, my response was the coconut oil amount is low on purpose because the skin on your face is a lot more sensitive than the skin on your body, and you don't want to dry out your skin on your face. And so it was interesting because the reason I used low coconut oil was to provide, less drying on your face. But then this person was thinking that the cleansing number, which makes sense because the word is cleansing, that it's not going to clean as well. But the reality is that all soap cleans. All of these formulas will clean. 100% coconut oil soap will clean, as will 100% olive oil soap. So it's kind of more of an oil stripping number is kind of how I think about it. So for me, cleansing is kind of a negative. Hardness is a positive, but it is a variable number as well. I typically tend to look at conditioning, bubbly, and creamy a little bit more than those other two numbers. All right, that was a lot. Hopefully it all made sense. I was kind of going through it pretty quick and sort of off the top of my head because I wanted to show you my process for when I look at a recipe, what I do or what I'm thinking in my head. And I think that a lot of this comes with time and with experience. And I encourage you to not just make the recipes that I came up with here, but to come up with your own. Try using different oils, try using canola oil, see if you like it. I haven't used it in ages, so I don't even really remember what it feels like. But there are a ton of fun oils. Our soaps are all vegan. The oils are all vegan. And you might want to try doing a lard or tallow soap, which I've heard are incredible. So definitely branch out, try some different oils, but be conscious of, when you click on this oil, especially some of the more expensive oils like argan oil, for instance, take a look at what it's really providing for your soap. And can you find another oil that does something similar, perhaps has very similar fatty acid profile, but will be less expensive and more doable for you if you're, running a business. But at the same time, try the argan oil and see what it feels like too, because that would also be fun. I mean, soap formulation, in my mind, is one of the most fun parts about soap making. So play around with the calculator. I probably spent a year formulating our soap recipes, which we have available on our website, by the way, if you're interested. But this is how I did it, exactly how I did it. I tried all kinds of different soaps, actually made that soap in a small batch to see what it would feel like. And then based on those results, I would increase or decrease different ingredients or get rid of certain ingredients entirely. And anyway, it was a really fun process, especially when I was formulating palm-free soap recipes, because I really wanted to achieve a certain feel in a bar of soap that was similar to a soap with palm oil, but not use the palm oil in there. And nowadays, there's a ton of palm-free recipes out there that are amazing. So those are great places to start as well. Anyway, I'm kind of rambling now, but we'll wrap it up. And thanks again for watching, and we'll see you next time. Bye.